Well, good afternoon. Thanks for coming out this afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be on campus on such an exciting and eventful day for the life of Gordon. It's a dear privilege to be introduced by my precious friend Vicki and to enjoy this opportunity to cross paths again here, right in where they live and call home. So thanks for welcoming me into your community. As I indicated in chapel this morning, if you were there, I want to begin by asking you to think of the mental map of life that you've got going on in your mind. You may not have ever thought of it as a map, but I think if we probe our thoughts either explicitly or latent there, we have some expectations for what life is going to bring our way in the next 10, 15 years. So what does that look like in your mind? Just think about this for a minute. What do you expect to be doing vocationally? What do you expect in terms of relationships? Maybe you picture yourself overseas on a mission field, maybe teaching in a suburban school, maybe involved in an inner city ministry, maybe married. Well, I know most of you have come of driving age in the era of GPS, but I hope there are a few of you in the room who remember that ancient tool for navigation that was called the Road Atlas. Maybe you've heard of this. Maybe your grandparents had one. It was a book, for those of you who haven't seen one or held one in your hands, it was a book of maps. It was 50 maps, one for each state. And this was really critical because before GPS, this is how you got around. You needed a map. And it was such an essential tool that it would always be everywhere in the car. It'd be under the seat and on the back dash and in the trunk, and half of Massachusetts would get ripped out because you'd been on it so many times. And the thing about a road atlas that's very different from GPS is you couldn't update it instantly. So when you were going through a town like Atlanta in the 80s or 90s that was facing enormous growth, you would find yourself on a road and with these green road signs announcing roads that the map says don't exist. So as far as the road atlas is concerned, this road that you're on doesn't exist. It's not reality. And yet you're on a newly paved 6-lane highway in Atlanta facing a choice in front of you, and you have no tools to deal with that, no way of discerning that from the map that's in your mind, in your hands. And this was how I felt at the verge of 30 when my mental map of life was completely dissonant with what I was facing at that point in my life. Now, if somebody had come to chapel when I was a senior at Wheaton College and asked me where I would be in 10 years and 12 years, it was a no-brainer. I was going to be married. I was going to have kids. I was not at all going to be in the work world like I am now. And yet, the path that I have been on has been much different than that. So I use that illustration just to bring to a head the point that what we are thinking in our minds, the expectations we have of what life will bring, may well disappoint us. So that leaves us with a critical question. How are we going to navigate through life? Well, there's a wrong way, and that's kind of the way that I've been describing. That's fixing our eyes on the milestones and that are our expectations for where we think we will be. And these, we build our own script for what we think the sequence of life is going to be. And not only that, it's not just the sequence of life that we think we know. We think we know what the timing of that sequence should be. So often we're making assumptions about, I'll graduate from here, I'm going to get my master's degree, then I'm going to work 5 years, then I'm going to meet Mr. Right, and then I'm going to have a few more years of working and reach the professional level that I'd like to, and then I'll have kids. We are staging this in our minds to some degree. Maybe it's a little less for you, maybe it's a little more for you. Whatever it is, though, I think we often slip into this sense of having these very concrete expectations for what life will bring. Well, the trouble with fixating on those milestones is that we can downplay or even begin to despise the time between those milestones. And that really deprives us from the joy and contentment that we should be finding right here and now. Well, the fact is that God's roadmaps don't work at all like like we want. They don't work like Google Maps, where we can choose our preferred destination and the most efficient way to get there. God's roadmaps are going to lead us on all kinds of hairpin turns that don't seem to make any sense. They're going to be inefficient and leave us asking why and are we there yet, like the 6-year-old in the back of the family car on summer vacation. So the challenge is for us to make wise plans while keeping a heart poised between where we are now, what we hope for, and what God will actually bring about in the future. That's why I chose the title, Now and Not Yet, for the book I wrote on the unexpected in between of singleness. And you'll probably recognize that that phrase has to do with the kingdom of God, which has begun, but has not yet reached fulfillment. And that has application for how we live right here, today, every day. Even as we long for the fulfillment of the desire of our heart, whether that's getting into medical school, getting married, getting across the ocean to a mission field, whatever that desire of our hearts, the here and now has significance. So I want to talk a little bit about how we equip ourselves to have that heart poised between now and the not yet ahead. And a better set of navigational tools, I think, comes to us in the form of our callings. Living with contentment today, while our hopes remain unfulfilled, means we've got to have a sense of purpose that transcends shifting dynamics, shifting circumstances, and our shifting feelings about those circumstances. It rests on a conviction that there is a grand design to our lives. That design is determined by our first call, the call to glorify and enjoy God. That's the single, overriding, eternal purpose of our lives. And it may be the only thing that doesn't change, so cling to it dearly, even as everything else in your life is transitioning for the years to come. So our first and highest call is to glorify God. Our everyday callings are the specific ways we do that, and there are many of them, so I'm using the plural very purposefully there. God has created each of us with gifts and given us opportunities to use them. Discovering those gifts and the passions that we have about life around us is the great joy of this phase of your lives. And it's also the great joy of single life. We have extraordinary freedom to be able to explore these gifts and apply them in innovative ways to the world around us. And that's a wonderful treasure of this time in your lives. So the idea of calling shouldn't be equated with just one role in life or one job. However great that is as a fit for your gifts, however many hours that takes up compared to anything else in your life, it shouldn't be equated with one job or one role like a wife or a mother or so on. Each of us has multiple callings today and will for the rest of our lives. Marriage, for example, might be a part of those callings one day, but even then, it will not be the entirety of what you are called to do. It will not be the only way that you are called to glorify and enjoy God. So our callings are the purposes that God has for us right here and now, and we should expect them to change with time. We shouldn't be disoriented when they do change as well. So how do we figure out what those purposes are? Well, I think it's helpful to look at 4 broad categories in life. And those are our relationships, our responsibilities, our gifts, and our opportunities. Figuring out what my callings are means taking inventory of those things. So in terms of relationships, many of us, we are sons and daughters. We are siblings. We are roommates. Our responsibilities. Each of you is a citizen of some country, most of you from the United States. Each of you is a student. That implies certain responsibilities for this stage in your life. Each of you has been created with gifts, wonderful artistic gifts in some cases, scientific gifts, teaching gifts, athletic gifts. And then each of us has opportunities. The fact that you are here means you have extraordinary opportunity. And we live in a day and age where all of us have incredible mobility that was unknown in times past. That means that we're going to have to be making choices about what we do with our relationships, responsibilities, and gifts. And so how do we make wise choices and survey the opportunities that we've been given? Well, it's going to be taking inventory in those other areas and seeing how they match up with the opportunities around us. So in comparison, and in contrast to what I was talking about before, fixating on those milestones and trying somehow to make sense of and judge our progress in life through those milestones, this perspective puts us in a role of thinking about how to steward what God has given us, almost like an investment portfolio of life. Stewardship demands that we're regularly taking that inventory in all that we've been given in the areas I've just mentioned to discern how we can best glorify God right here and now and for the future. Now, most of the decisions you're going to face for the next decade are not between clear choices of right and wrong. There'll be between competing options that are good and right, like, should I go on to get my graduate degree now, or should I wait for it? Should I buy a house, or should I rent? These are the kinds of things that you're going to be facing in the next couple of decades of life, and they will test your sense of discernment about how best to use what you've been given. So to be equipped for that, getting in the habit of taking inventory of these areas that I've suggested is an extraordinary discipline, but it has extraordinary payoffs for the kinds of decisions you'll be facing in the next decade and 2 decades down the road. This perspective also helps us discern God's purpose in the winding path that from our milestone fixation doesn't really make much sense, because I'd really like to get to that next milestone as efficiently as possible. But if we're looking at our lives through the sense of callings, we can maybe discern a little bit more why God is maybe winding us through some curves that we didn't expect. For example, 15 years ago, I could not have anticipated where I would be today talking to you about this. I had a whole different life plan, as I mentioned. But now, as I look back and survey the relationships, the responsibilities, the gifts, the opportunities that I've been given, I can see what purposes God has had in this, and I can see that it's been used to His greater glory, and I can rejoice in that in a way that I wouldn't be able to if I were fixating still on the milestones that I still haven't met in my life. Now, because relationships are such a big part of the equation of discerning what our callings are, I want to talk specifically about them for a little bit. Now, if those of you in the room today are any representative at all of the national surveys in this area, you probably want to get married someday. The overwhelming majority of young people do. And I would guess that you maybe are anticipating that that'll happen sometime during your 20s or perhaps early 30s. Well, the reality is that probably a third of you in this room will be single at age 30. For some of you, that's totally fine. That's exactly the time that you anticipated it being on your script anyway. No problem. But for others of you, the prospect of turning 30 without having found a companion for life might give you a sinking heart. Now, data is not destiny, of course, but it's a cause for realism and sober judgment about where we're at and where we're going. And I think considering how we view marriage can also help us with our expectations about other areas as well. The reality is that you and I have inherited the fruits of the feminist movement and of the sexual revolution, and both of these have changed a lot about our culture, the way that men and women view each other, the way that women are pictured in society as well. And it's made single life and the pursuit of marriage much more challenging than it was in the past. So we need to talk about this. How will these cultural dynamics affect your next decade of life, your reality, your expectations, your decisions? My own 20-something experience and what I saw in my peers and friends around me led me to write this book about this subject. And it was released about 4 years ago. And I wrote it in my mid-30s. I'm now 39, just to keep you from guessing, to help equip young women in particular who seemed disoriented between this gap between their expectations and their reality, particularly in their 20s. But it wasn't just women who were confused. When I went about researching for the book, I talked to a number of men as well, and they were similarly baffled by why does this have to be so confusing, and perplexed by this unexpected in-between of singleness lasting longer than they had expected as well. So that prompted me to look a little deeper at the cultural factors that were contributing to this, including the changes in the social views of women. The feminist movement has led to many new opportunities for women, and we have extraordinary educational opportunities, new vocational horizons as a result. That's a terrific thing. That's a wonderful development. But the all-important question for us as women is why we're pursuing those goals. For many feminists, the rationale has generally been one that's oriented around power, to be in control of their lives, to be independent from men. In the extreme cases, to be liberated from marriage and motherhood. Well, a diluted version of this power perspective filters its way into our everyday lives in things like advertising. Think of all the ways that "you go girl" message is out there today. Another version is the popular stereotype of the career woman who's way into her job so much that she has no time to think about men or marriage or motherhood. And stereotypes like this have a way of influencing our assumptions about one another and the way that we interact. So when I wrote my book, I interviewed several dozen professionally successful single women between the ages of 30 and 45. And a number of them expressed concern about whether their lives were being read according to this career woman script in a way that they never intended. But because that was the stereotype out there, they feared that that was the impression they were giving. Now, I'm using the example of women here, but we could equally talk about the stereotypes of men in society that are projected on men and become our assumptions as we look at each other. And of course, these are caricatures, but they point to some real confusion and tension about how we relate to one another as men and women, and to that eternal pursuit of trying to feel comfortable in our own skin. It's tempting to look at the opposite sex through the lens of these cultural stereotypes. We see each other through a sort of cultural fog, and it's difficult to cut through that fog to see one another for the unique individuals that God has created us to be, not that fog and misrepresentation that these cultural stereotypes give. The sexual revolution is another story that complicates matters. Clearly, this is not our parents' dating world. And on some college campuses today, hopefully not this one, casual hooking up or just hanging out informally with no particular direction is much more common than dating that's purposeful and directed towards marriage. And even if this Christian college campus is different than other campuses across the country, it's certainly going to be a new story once you leave. The hookup scene and the hangout culture have made relationships between men and women much more difficult. And as a result, the path towards marriage is far more confusing than it has been in generations past. That means that this area is one of those crying out for attention by Christians to bring a healing to the brokenness that we find in the relational area of life. That should begin with us modeling appropriate relationships. Ephesians 4:1 says, live a life worthy of the calling you have received. And that includes our relationships. Singleness is lasting much longer than it did for our parents' generation. On average, the median age of first marriage has risen 5 years since our parents' generation. That's a significant demographic shift, one that we're not talking about much. That means that as singleness lasts longer, we can expect a lot more frustration and false starts in relationships along the way. Serial romances that end in bitterness and frustration and disappointment can make things all the worse. Because of that confusion, people are naturally looking for ways to try to make this easier. And about a dozen years ago, there was a best-selling book that was called The Rules. You can guess where this is going. The subtitle was Time-Tested Secrets for Capturing the Heart of Mr. Right. And capturing said it all. It was basically a guidebook for women on how to snag a man. Some of the advice was good. It was telling women not to be too easy, suggesting that we not be obsessive and smothering and scare men off. Not that we need that advice. But its basic motivation boiled down to controlling and manipulating men to getting what we as women want. It was a coaching women to be coy and manipulative in their responses to men. Well, it's not just this one book. Think about so much of the advice that's out there today about how to get what you want in relationships. Just any checkout aisle at any grocery store, and this is the message that those magazines are sending. Much of it ends up promoting psychological game playing and manipulation and control of others. It's certainly not encouraging us to show the fruit of the Spirit. It's as though we have one rule for how we're to deal with family, coworkers, neighbors, everybody, and then a separate rule for how to manipulate and control the situation to get exactly what you want out of a romantic relationship. All's fair in love and war, after all, right? Well, I hope you've been watching the news and see that not all is fair in war. There are some rules of engagement. And that's the same for love as well. There are rules of engagement. And when we read Scripture, especially in the verses following that, Ephesians 4:1 verse that I just read, live a life worthy of the calling you have received. We have some verses in the next chapter, Ephesians 4 and 5, that spell out what the character of our relationships ought to look like. I want to read a few of those. And as I'm doing this, as I'm reading them, consider how this should influence our hopes for relationships, the conduct of our relationships, and particularly the endings of relationships. Because we know that as we're walking this road of singleness longer, there are going to be more endings of relationships. Learning how to do that well is part of the test of a good relationship. So Ephesians 4:2 and 3, be completely humble and gentle. Be patient, bearing with one another in love. Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. Ephesians 4:29, do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building one another up according to their needs. Ephesians 4:32, be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you. Ephesians 5:1 and 2, be imitators of God, therefore, as dearly loved children, and live a life of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. This is what it looks like to pursue relationships in a way that is worthy of our first calling. As Christian brothers and sisters, we are co-heirs of the kingdom, but also co-victims of the chaos, of the feminist movement, of the sexual revolution, of all the changes of the last several decades. We are all confused, carry baggage, and make missteps. That calls for a charitable spirit towards one another as we try to relate. And rather than living by formulas that suggest coy manipulation or power games, we should be seeking to serve and encourage one another as we pursue our respective callings. Stewardship applies to relationships as well. It means we're not just leaving them up to autopilot, but being intentional and purposeful in our interactions and concerned about how our actions affect the other person. In any relationship, no matter what the character, with other believers, our objective is to appreciate one another as children of God, uniquely made in His image to glorify Him. And we glorify God by honoring and respecting and rejoicing in one another's gifts and helping one another along in how to pursue those. So this sense of purpose should define the way we act toward one another, whether in friendships or romantic relationships. And because of that, sharing the love of Christ is a far different strategy and objective than merely trying to snag a spouse, a la the rules. Our guiding purpose in a relationship should be to delight in and respect the other person in a way that reflects how we enjoy and glorify God as well. Our lives should be a beautiful fragrance, the aroma of Christ, as 2 Corinthians 2:15 puts it. Like a perfume that lingers in a hall, we should aim for all our interactions to leave others desiring what is good and right and true. We can't control the outcome of any relationship, but we can control our stewardship of it for however long it endures. That's what it means to be faithful to our first call in the context of relationships. In conclusion here, I just want to offer a couple of practical things, practical ideas for taking on this next decade of your lives. The first is to cultivate community. Now, a college campus, and particularly one like Gordon, is instant community. In fact, I imagine most of you probably have trouble finding a quiet spot alone, if anything, here on campus. Well, that's going to change when you leave. You are going to have to be purposeful and intentional about finding and committing to community, finding friends that you will invest in, finding a congregation that you will attach yourself to in an accountable relationship. You'll have to choose to make those accountable relationships, but it will be worth it. Keep diverse company. We tend to like to hang out with people who are in the same stage of life as we are. And that means that they usually have the same blind spots, and they're cynical about the same things, and they have the same vulnerabilities that we do. This is why it's a good idea to be around people who are in different stages of life, who are dealing with different challenges and celebrating different joys than you have in your own. This helps us learn what it is to be the body of Christ, to bear one another's burdens truly, and share one another's joys. And doing so gives us a lot better perspective on our own struggles and what we're wrestling with. So I highly encourage walking alongside people who are in different life stations. Keep close friends for life. Vicki mentioned that we have a group of 6 women who get together each year, and we made that commitment when we left Wheaton College, and we get together for a weekend each year. And during that weekend, it's a lot of accountability, it's progress checking, it's spiritual progress checking most of all. And the warmth of that friendship over the years is one of the great treasures of life, that we know no matter what season we are all in, we will have those relationships. So I encourage you to find that friend or 2 or 3 or more that you will go through life with. And we live in a day, long distance calling used to be expensive. It's not anymore. There's Skype. There's all kinds of ways to keep in touch halfway around the world. So there aren't excuses really anymore. We can keep in touch and hold each other close. The more likely excuses these days are going to be that we simply didn't pursue it. We weren't intentional about those things. So make those choices now as you leave this community to find community and take that with you through your life. And finally, enjoy the here and now. Of course, dream big dreams about where you hope to go, and cherish those and do everything you can to steward and use your gifts to bring the best outcomes in the future. But don't do so at the expense of enjoying today and finding community and being able to enjoy those around you. May God grant you great joy in this journey. Thank you.
Question and answers?
I hope for those of you who are kind of tracking with our theme of spiritual disciplines this spring that you heard a lot of kind of disciplined talk in there. One is sometimes just exercising gratitude in the situation you find yourself in. But more than that, it's being proactive and reflecting on things, taking stock of those 4 elements. Remember, responsibilities, relationships, gifts, and opportunities. And then what a beautiful example of the discipline of friendship and community, exercising that over time. It's great stuff. We've got a little bit of time for some question and answers. Anyone have questions for Dr. Marshall?
Can you tell us a little bit about how your life sort of took the turn that it did and what you're doing?
Sure. So I left Wheaton College, and, I should put it this way. I was a French major and planning to teach. And so that took me to France, and I did my student teaching at the Black Forest Academy back-to-back summer between junior year and senior year, and then student teaching the fall of senior year. And I came back. Europe made me think, wow, this is a very post-Christian, postmodern society. I wonder who's doing anything about that in America. That put me into tracking down the whole field of public policy, which I am ashamed to say didn't know existed as a senior in college. I wouldn't have been able to tell you that term. But as I was reading people and trying to understand more about who was engaging with the culture and the direction of our country, that led me to an internship in Washington, D.C. I loved it. I found that my gifts were better expressed there than they sometimes were in the classroom. And so I ended up staying beyond the internship. And it's been now 17 years that I've been in Washington. I'm now at a think tank called the Heritage Foundation, and I direct a team of analysts on the cultural issues, which means that we try to prepare members of Congress and other federal decision makers to make wise decisions about the future of our country, particularly in the areas, and my team deals with education, welfare, family, marriage, religion, and so on. So I would say that, it wasn't anything I orchestrated, and I always thought marriage would come along because I went to Washington thinking, here I am working, and this is only going to be like a 3 or 4 year stint, and then I'm going to get married and have kids. I felt like I had to fit a lot into those first 3 or 4 years. So I developed these patterns that weren't too healthy of working long hours and cramming a lot in, and those are the kinds of habits that you have to watch out for, I think, early on in your 20s. The patterns you set there will be hard to break later on in life. So be wise about your time commitments in particular, and realize that all of us should value relationships. I think at different seasons of our lives we're better at doing that, but always in our lives relationships take time, energy, and commitment. And therefore you must be leaving the margins in your life that allow those to happen. Yeah, Mani.
How have you been able to stay so content being single for 39 years?
I wrestle. I wrestle. I have it out with God a lot. And so I'm not content every day. And I don't think we should be surprised when we're not. When we do hope for something in the future, we will wrestle with that. And it's okay to get in God's face about things and, realize He's bigger than you. He's going to shout you down. But to the psalmist sets a good example of that. The ups and the downs of his emotional psyche and, but always returning to, after that wrestling match, understanding a contented place before God. And what that does also is to make you appreciate the glimpses that we catch every so often of, aha, I understand now. I'm up on a gracious plateau where God's led me so I can see all the purposes in all that broken road leading to this point. Those are the moments that you cherish most, I think, in life, any of these things. That's mine.
In your opinion, what's the difference between being patient and moving on from the person or a relationship?
Yeah. Can you give me a little more context there? That's a big question.
Such as just like, we're told to be patient.
Uh-huh.
Waiting, almost letting the guy pursue the girl and not taking that step. How do we discern the difference?
Got it. Okay. So a lot of the stuff I said about relating to one another as co-heirs of the kingdom had that question in mind. So I think particularly as females, we're worried about game playing, when am I doing this to be manipulative of the situation? When am I just really genuinely trying to be a friend here and, positive about relationships? And I think as much as we can keep a bearing of treating all people, regardless of our interests in that person, as I want this person to thrive in their callings. And so what can I do in my interactions with him to help him do that here in the type of relationship that we have right now, so that I don't have to second guess my motives in this situation. I am earnestly, genuinely interested in his flourishing in his callings before God. I think keeping that orientation, and it's not just for would-be romantic relationships, it's all our friendships, right? It's any interactions we have with others, with fellow believers, we should be seeking that out. And that allows you to not play the, second-guessing game about joyful hospitality and warmth in all directions that should have lots of creativity to it. You don't have to second-guess your motives about trying to do things that will love and encourage everybody around you and individuals around you. That makes sense. Yes?
Thank you so much for coming today.
You're welcome.
This little lecture. I just wonder in your perspective, where do you think American culture is right now, on the inside the Christian community and outside, and how does that interact with the international community? That I don't know if that makes sense, but I just wonder, especially for this generation.
I think we are facing extraordinary brokenness on the relational plane in so many different ways. And we're all touched by it in one way or another. Our parents' ruptured relationships, as you get older, your siblings' ruptured relationships, your own ruptured relationships, just all kinds of ways that we're touched by the heartbreak of relationships. And I hope that we as a church and Christian community can begin to take stock of that very soberly in a way that empathizes with that pain and then begins to help people rise above it and break the cycles. Because that's the other thing about relational breakdown. It's so cyclical, generation after generation, and it just kind of metastasizes almost in culture. So the church has enormous, if there's one thing the church has, it's relational capital, because we have the great endowment of Christ's love that we can then pass on. So if we could have a greater sense of that, and I think we only scratch the surface in our understanding of it, and begin to model in the church community what true relationship and community look like, and then that could be, just like we look back at the great the social outreach missions of the last couple of centuries and how Christians really paved the way in that. I think the new revolution that we need, that the church could bring about, would be a relational revolution. And that, is a lifetime's work that I hope many of you will pursue. Yes, sorry.
Thank you very much for your talk.
You're welcome.
You mentioned taking inventory before you make large decisions, or any decisions at all, actually, discerning is important, but what does that taking inventory look like for you?
So I think this is a great question, and let me answer it way close up and then back to some principles. One thing I do at the beginning of each year, and you may do it in a variety of different ways, but here's how I do it. I try to go out on New Year's Day to find a quiet spot. I go to Great Falls State Park near Washington, D.C., and sit on a rock looking out on a waterfall. And I take inventory in my life at that point. And I say, what are the blessings in my life right now, the challenges in my life, what are the relationships that I need to be working on, and what are the responsibilities I have. And I literally try to go through it as concretely as possible there and say, what are the challenges? What are the things I'm just throwing up my hands to God and I have no idea how this is going to work out, but I'm surrendering it to Him. And because I've done that now for almost 10 years, I think, there's a neat path that's forming out of it. And I can, I look at last year's list and I say, there's some of those things are resolved now. Or I see, it's a pattern. So I see a new way opening for me to apply my gifts in these opportunities that are emerging. So that's a very concrete shape of what the inventory looks like. The other thing is less literal. It's just reflecting on your life in those categories so that you know yourself well. And therefore, you don't even have to think of it very explicitly as you get in the habit of doing that. You're just sort of, oh, wait, I'm not really good at that, so I won't even begin to think down that line. Or, wow, I know this is what makes me tick. And I know that with the relationships I have right now, this is exactly what would be a good fit. And they also kind of cancel each other out. Relationships and responsibilities imply obligations. gifts and opportunities are openings. So it's kind of like two sides of a ledger. I think of it that way, and I think this is important also for the next stages in your lives, particularly as women, as you're going to think about juggling marriage and motherhood and vocational opportunities in the future. You have to think concretely about what are the relationships that I'm in and the responsibilities that I have mean for the use of my gifts and opportunities at this stage in life. So it's also thinking about balancing both sides of that ledger appropriately. And it's going to be a different balance at each stage in life, and that's okay. Yeah.
You sort of referenced that you feel like this is something that the church should address a little bit more. If you could sort of dream up what you feel like the American church might do to help address this, what would it be?
One thing that the church could do to better address this area is to have married couples who have a degree of track record. I'm talking like 10 or maybe 40 years, either anywhere in that track, but have some history together to take a more conscious role in mentoring those who are not yet married and would like to be married, and mentoring those who are just taking their first steps into marriage. And I've seen some successes in this in terms of older married men mentoring younger men, encouraging them to take the steps and maturity and responsibility to pursue relationships towards marriage. It might be as fun and silly as helping try to match people up, because it's hard to meet people that have that same, this is different than a college campus scene. When you're out in the work world, it's a whole different scenario. And so helping make those opportunities for fellowship in the future. And then relational triage and repair. I think we have to recognize we have to let people be vulnerable, and the church should be a place where people can be vulnerable about their relational pain and their struggles, be that in marriage or in any other situation. That means that churches must not be places where gossip happens. And I beg you to conduct yourselves as members of churches by not gossiping. Because that is critical to the church being a safe place to share relational pain. Anything else? Yeah.
Do you feel like there's been, not necessarily from the church, but maybe from other Christian women, like a pressure to get married and a pressure to have that more stereotypical life, or do you feel like it's been accepted and that it's been, most people are okay with it?
And do you mean my personal experience or writ large? I never felt pressured because it was always a desire of my own heart. So if the pressure was from anywhere, it was from in here. There's one of the things I sometimes say, and I said it at the talks that I gave at churches this weekend to older women, was we have to know each other. Community means that we must know each other well enough to ask questions that are edifying and constructive. And there are ways that we can ask questions that aren't. And I mean that with regard to relational status. I mean it even more with regard to fertility status. My married friends who are struggling with fertility get asked painful questions at church, like, why aren't you just flipping the switch to get pregnant? Well, that's exactly what they wonder too, why God's not doing that. So knowing each other well enough to ask questions about those deep places in our lives, we have to do it. We shouldn't avoid it, but we have to ask them well and in a way that's constructive. Yeah.
What are your thoughts about women and the opportunities that we have to go on to further education and investing ourselves in that, but then somewhere along the lines meeting someone and kind of backing out of that world and starting family?
Yes, very good question. For starters, the whole calling set of things is to help us evaluate that. So reflect on that. But more concretely to the specific question you're asking about, recognize that some callings do have expiration dates on them. You can't have a child at current technology levels at 55, right? So there is a reason that marriage and motherhood typically begins in the 20s. That's where fertility is most opportune. The recognizing as well that there are opportunities to sequence a lot of things in life, and you don't have to feel like an investment in an education is thrown away by getting married and having children. To the contrary, you're endowing that immediately into a new generation. And there is always the opportunity to come back to a profession. In fact, it's funny because in more traditional days, there was the concept that women could be nurses or teachers, maybe a couple of other jobs, secretary and so on. As I look at it, those are kind of not very... nursing has become flexible. You can take shift work whenever you can get it. But going on to get advanced degrees, like I think of a law degree, you can use that in so many flexible ways and fit that with the other desires of your heart to have a family, that I think it's go for it. Get your education, because that will make you more multi-talented and have more applications to put the units of life together in creative ways that you might not have seen before otherwise. So I think our creativity fails us sometimes when we think about this question. And we judge according to a timesheet, like 40 hour in the home or 40 hours out of the home. And those aren't the choices in front of women anymore. We can be extraordinarily creative about this. Telecommuting, part-time, all kinds of great things are out there. So push the professional envelope. Don't hold back if you're interested in family and so on. There are ways that allows you then to, but don't let that, at the same time, the pursuing those goals and pursuing higher education and vocational success, don't ever at any stage of life check relationships at the door. And I'm not just talking about romantic, I'm talking about friendship and family and other things. Have balance by having a diverse set of relationships in your life at any stage. So don't put off relationships of any sort at any stage of life, I guess is the counsel.
Well, thank you. Well, that's a great question, Lynn.